Cannabis use has been used for thousands of years, with the first uses by humans dating back as far as 12,000 BCE, likely originating in Central Asia. In what is now known as Canada, cannabis use was uncommon until the 1960s and 70s, when use became more popular, especially among middle and upper-class white youth, particularly as part of the anti-war counterculture and the hippie movement originating in the United States. This movement sought to take a stance against racism, poverty, and the lack of women's rights. However, cannabis became illegal much earlier, despite not being used much throughout the country. In fact, it was added to the list of prohibited substances in 1923 as part of a larger movement toward making all sorts of substances illegal. How come then did weed get swept up with the prohibition of other drugs like opium, cocaine, and morphine if it wasn't even really being used in Canada? It's difficult to pinpoint just one answer. Several forces were at play, and there was no debate in the House of Commons regarding the addition of cannabis to the list of prohibited substances, making record-keeping pretty tricky. Still, there is some evidence that this move was supported by the advocacy from well-known women's rights and temperance movement activists such as Emily Murphy. Murphy used racist narratives around the potential for cannabis to encourage interracial and, in her view, undesirable relations, as well as violence in people who used cannabis. However, some say the role of Emily Murphy and other temperance movement activists is overstated, and that international politics and a global move to control the use of drugs is a more likely explanation. Indeed, international politics, and particularly the influence of the United States, continued to shape the criminalization of people who use cannabis well into the 1970s and 1980s. Regardless of what spurred the prohibition of cannabis initially, it was soon propped up in the anti-drug reefer madness propaganda of the United States during the 1930s. This movement was also based, at least in part, in racism directed particularly towards Mexican immigrants in the States. Despite not being sure exactly what led to cannabis becoming illegal, what's for sure is that this history is full of stigmatization, much of which relied on racist and xenophobic narratives. When understanding cannabis today, it is so important that we keep this history in mind, as these narratives and their consequences still exist to this day. This is just a bit of background around cannabis in Canada, but this plant has a rich history and cultural contribution all across the globe. Check out these resources for more.